Murphy, Ronald Reagan, and Robert Montgomery are among the top flight movie actors testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington. Appearing before the inquiry board investigating communist infiltration in Hollywood, producer Sam Wood wastes no words condemning the Red Party line.
These old newsreels reflect a dark period in the history of democracy in the United States. I'm Len Scher, and the spectacle before me is the open witch hunt that occurred in the movie business in Hollywood 50 years ago.
Now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party of the United States?
Hundreds of actors and writers, producers, directors had their careers destroyed. Some courageously fought back, defending their right to freedom of speech.
Mr. Chairman, will you direct the witness to answer that question? Answer the question. And that is because rights in the industry, chaos in the industry, and direct the witness to answer that question, Mr. Chairman, before he leaves his stand. I have not refused to answer the question. I told you before I will answer this question.
What few people know is that Canada had a blacklist too. But unlike the United States, there was no way to fight it. The blacklist affected many lives. I was 18 when I felt the sting of the blacklist. In 1967, my father, Len Scher, was about to fly to New York on his way to Israel. It was to be his first trip abroad to visit his relatives since coming to Canada years earlier, and he had saved the money for the ticket over many years. My dad's luggage departed, but he didn't get out of Montreal that day. U.S. immigration officers refused him at the gate. My father's name had appeared on the U.S. blacklist. I cannot forget the humiliation on his face. My dad turned ashen, and his hands shook when he was forbidden to board the flight. He came to Canada seeking a haven after surviving the Holocaust, which had claimed most of his family. He wasn't a security risk or a spy, yet the RCMP had given his name to the FBI. The UnCanadians story begins in September 1945, when Canada was celebrating the end of 15 years of depression and war. Peace generated a new optimism, but it was disrupted by news of an enormous spy scandal. A cipher clerk in the Russian embassy in Ottawa defected with evidence of a spy ring in Canada's civil service. His name was Igor Guzenko. The case was to become the first chill of the Cold War. Canadians were stunned that our wartime ally was spying on us. Several of the Canadians arrested, including a communist member of parliament, were convicted of espionage. Not only communists were potential spies, anyone with left-wing beliefs or associations was suspect. Reaction in official Ottawa was swift. The government took action to counter the new threat. Prime Minister Mackenzie King and his cabinet issued orders that would lead to a Canadian blacklist. We never had a House Committee on Un-Canadian activities. Instead, behind closed doors in Ottawa, A security panel composed of high-ranking public servants drafted Canada's security plan. Officially, the objective was to protect Canada's secrets. But the guiding principle was fear of communism. The panel created an elaborate national security apparatus which spied on the most ordinary of Canadians, people like my father. The security panel was careful to avoid the hysteria of our neighbors to the south. Its first decision was to screen every federal civil servant. All employees who aroused suspicion were subject to a secret RCMP investigation. Knowing what happened to my father, I set out to discover if his fate was part of a larger pattern. I was beginning to learn there were others whose lives had been somehow damaged because their names were on a blacklist. Jan Eisenhardt's life in Canada started out with great promise. An immigrant from Denmark, he arrived in Canada in the 1930s. An expert in the field of physical fitness, he was hired to be Director of Physical Training for all of British Columbia. He was devoted to his career and to his new country.
This country, I chose it, and I loved it so much. My wife was pregnant in Paris, and I got her to go home to Canada to have her firstborn in Canada, to be a Canadian, full-blooded Canadian.
When World War II broke out, Eisenhardt signed up for duty. He was given the assignment of designing a fitness program for Canada's military recruits.
I outlined a sports program, which they didn't have before. Before, they did whatever happened to them. Now we got a real program going for the whole of Canada and for overseas too. I had a cross-country run where everybody in the army were running, you know. Everything was organized in such a way that it would help the war effort.
Soon promoted to the rank of major, Eisenhardt went to meetings and gave talks on fitness. This brought him into contact with representatives of the Soviet Union, our wartime ally. He represented the Army at youth gatherings of the Canada-Russia Friendship Committee. He shared a platform with the Soviet ambassador. It was all perfectly normal at the time, but these were the kind of contacts that later aroused suspicions. In 1950, Eisenhardt was hired by the aircraft manufacturer Canadair, a subsidiary of the American arms giant General Dynamics. Eisenhardt and his young family moved to Montreal, where he was put in charge of employee fitness. But it was here his troubles began.
There must have been about 20,000 workers at Canadair, and it was interesting to outline a program for them. And I thought that was secure. One night, I have a meeting with people from Allder, and I get a call from next door. The director of personnel would like to see me, and I go in. And the first thing he says when I come in, "You're fired, Eisenhardt." I thought it was a joke, and I sat down. He handed me a check. I looked at it, a few $100. I said, "Why am I fired?" "Well, you got more enemies in Ottawa than friends."
The RCMP security service had him in its net. His house was watched, his neighbors questioned. Incredibly, one neighbor interviewed was a former Luftwaffe pilot.
I went to the head of the mounted police. He knew my work. He knew all about me, what I've done for Canada. He told me, we have no file on you. So I said, make sure of it. And he said, I will make sure of it, and if I find anything, I'll get in touch with you. He never did get in touch with me. I kept ringing his office and trying to see him again. I never found out. It was such a shock, so unexpected. I go from a government department into a civilian job, and I'm fired. I can't understand it. No, my life my career was finished. I don't think that I let my family really know how bad it was, but emotionally it was terrible. I could easily have killed myself, easily. I was so devastated by this.
My dad always put a very brave face on it and kept going. But I could never understand his room full of memorabilia and what had happened to him. And the couple of times that I did ask, it was my mom that cut me off. She was more afraid. She became almost agoraphobic. Some people are more sensitive than others when they're slammed by it, and someone they love is slammed by it and cut off at the knees. You don't often recover from that.
An insurance company, Dominion Life, they offered me a job as manager for their group insurance in Quebec. But I wasn't finished with it. This is now 1955, 56. The mounted police went to the manager of the French office here, Monsieur Paul Babby, and told him that they should beware of me because things were not as they seemed to be on the surface. And he told them in good French, get the hell out of here.
Eisenhardt's friendship with his loyal employer has endured. Over time, Bappy revealed the rest of the story. The RCMP came to warn him that Eisenhardt was a danger. They dismissed Bappy's defense of his friend, declaring, better that 2 innocents suffer than 1 spy get away. Even now, Eisenhardt does not know why he was harassed for so many years.
You have to experience it to know what it means. You seem to have been. You seem to have been dirtied by something. You can't clean yourself. Even after all these years. Just talking about it. It's almost too much.
I've never seen my father cry except recently when my mom passed away. And when this is the first time that he's ever talked publicly about this experience. And to know how deeply he was affected and how much that must, by virtue of what we know today about psychological impact, how much that must have affected all of us, not just me. I'm one of 4 children. I'm very grateful that the story is being told so that he can go on now and put this to rest.
Was Eisenhardt's treatment typical?